Gina's life had become a shadow of what it once was. For decades, she had lived in the background, silently eroded by the people she loved the most. There was a time when she was vibrant, full of hope, with dreams that filled her heart and lightened her soul. But those days were long gone. Now she was just a quiet presence, a woman whose voice no one seemed to hear. No one but her. Each day, Gina woke up in a world that didn't truly see her. She drifted through her routines like an echo of someone else, performing tasks without being noticed, offering herself to others with no one to offer back. Her emotional needs were always pushed aside, dismissed as unnecessary. She had become a fixture in her own life, quietly fading into the walls, her worth reduced to whatever was left after everyone else had taken what they needed. David, the man she loved, the man she gave everything to, had made her invisible. It wasn't a dramatic moment of rejection, but a slow, insidious process. Little by little, she shrank. His criticisms, his demands, his neglect, each one a nail in the coffin of her identity. She had lived in his shadow for so long that she could barely remember who she was before him. But somewhere deep inside, Gina's heart still beat with a quiet, defiant pulse. The years of silence, the absence of validation, had built up in her, an unspoken weight she carried alone. She had been invisible for so long, but now a chance had come, a moment to finally speak, to be heard, to reclaim the voice she thought had long been lost. Gina had learned to live with silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that enveloped you in peace, but the kind that settled in the pit of your stomach, sick and suffocating. In her marriage with David, the silence had been a constant companion, louder than any argument or heated exchange. It was the silence of unspoken words, of needs unmet, of an intimacy that had long since withered into indifference. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first it was just a lack of connection, a subtle withdrawal from the man who once promised to cherish her. David, with his strong presence and commanding voice, was always the center of attention, and she had been content to exist quietly in his orbit. But over time, his warmth began to fade, replaced by a growing distance that seemed to stretch between them like an invisible chasm. The dinner table was the first sign. Once they had shared meals with laughter, discussions, and a sense of belonging. But now, the table felt like an empty stage, the two of them occupying opposite ends. Gina would prepare his favorite dishes, pouring her love into every detail. But when she set the plates down, David barely looked up from his phone, or the papers sprawled before him. The clink of cutlery was all that filled the air, louder than the words that had once flowed between them. Gina had stopped speaking unless spoken to, her words slipping through the cracks unnoticed. Her once vibrant laughter had dulled into a soft, hesitant sound that barely reached the edges of the room. She learned to shrink, to make herself smaller, so that she wouldn't be a bother. The smallest gestures, like when she reached out to touch David's arm for reassurance, were met with impatience or dismissal, leaving her to retreat further into herself. The silence wasn't just in the absence of conversation. It was in the way David looked through her, not at her. He would pass her in the hallway, his eyes glazed, his mind somewhere far away. And when he did glance in her direction, it was as if she was nothing more than a shadow, barely worth a second thought. She could feel it, the weight of his neglect pressing down on her, suffocating her sense of self. His world continued to revolve around his work, his clients, his accolades, and she became a distant blur on the periphery. But it was the little things that hurt the most, the things she could never quite name, the way he never asked about her day, never noticed the way she lingered by the window, waiting for him to come home, the soft sighs she'd exhale as she dusted the old photos on the mantel, longing for a time when their connection had meant something, and the way she would curl into bed at night, her back to his. The space between them widening until she wondered if there had ever been a time when they had been truly close. The house echoed with her solitude. The quiet was oppressive, wrapping around her like an invisible shroud. The ticking of the clock in the living room, the hum of the refrigerator, the low murmur of the TV that David barely watched. These were the sounds of her life. They became her companions, a reminder of just how far away she had drifted from everything she once held dear. She wasn't just isolated in the physical sense. She was isolated in her own home, in the life she had built. Yet she stayed. She stayed because she didn't know how to leave, how to stand up for herself when every part of her had been taught to stay small. She stayed because the silence had become familiar, and the idea of filling it with the truth, with confrontation, was a terrifying prospect. After all, in this silence she was invisible, but at least she was still here. One afternoon, as Gina wiped down the kitchen counter out of habit rather than need, a soft chime echoed from her phone. She almost ignored it. After all, who ever messaged her anymore? But something tugged at her and she picked it up. It was an email. Subject: invitation to speak at the Women's Empowerment Panel. Finding your voice. Gina frowned, confused at first, thinking it must have been sent to her by mistake. She tapped the screen and read further. We would be honored if you would join us as a guest speaker to share your personal journey of resilience, growth, and rediscovery. Your story has the power to inspire others who feel unseen, unheard, and forgotten. Gina's breath caught. Her story? What story? She wasn't the kind of woman who inspired others. She was the woman who blended into the background, who kept the peace by staying silent, who accepted that some battles weren't meant to be fought. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the phone down. Had someone seen her after all? Had her quiet suffering somehow left a mark beyond the confines of her lonely world? A low laugh escaped her lips, bitter, unsure. The idea was almost laughable. David would certainly think so. He'd probably roll his eyes, call it one of those sad little pity parties women throw to feel important. Yet the thought of standing up, even just once, and telling her truth stirred something deep inside her. Something long buried, fragile but persistent. She glanced toward the living room where David sat, glued to his laptop, the television droning mindlessly in the background. He hadn't noticed her for years. Would he even notice if she left? Gina pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the rapid beat of her heart. Fear, excitement, hope. Emotions she hadn't dared feel in a long, long time. Maybe this invitation was a mistake. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a door she could finally choose to walk through. For the first time in years, Gina realized she had a choice, and that terrified her even more than the silence. The hall buzzed with quiet conversation, the hum of hundreds of voices blurring into one overwhelming noise. Gina sat stiffly in her chair backstage, clutching the program in her sweaty palms. Her name was printed there, right next to the words. Guest speaker. It felt surreal. She smoothed the wrinkles out of her dress for the 10th time, every instinct screaming at her to run, to hide. Who was she to sit among these women, bold, fierce, polished? What could she possibly say that mattered? When the host called her name, her legs almost refused to move. But somehow, she stood. Somehow, she walked across the stage, blinded by the lights, the polite applause sounding far away. The microphone loomed in front of her. For a long second, she said nothing. She could feel the silence stretching, hear the impatient shuffling in the crowd. Then slowly, she looked up and saw them, rows of women, young and old, watching her not with judgment, but with something else. Recognition, understanding. She took a breath, another. And then, in a voice so soft it barely stirred the microphone, she began. For a long time I thought the only way to survive was to be quiet. The words trembled as they left her, but they were real. She saw a woman in the front row nod, tears brimming in her eyes. Gina's voice grew stronger. I thought if I didn't cause trouble, if I made myself small enough, maybe I'd finally be enough. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Her heart pounded, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was life, surging through her veins. She spoke of the loneliness that grew even when someone sat right beside you, of dreams tucked away in dusty corners, of waking up one day and realizing you couldn't even hear your own thoughts anymore over the noise of someone else's needs. And as she spoke, Gina could feel something inside her shift. Each word was a thread, weaving a bridge between her and every woman who had ever felt unseen. By the time she finished, there was no mistaking it. Applause thundered through the hall, not out of politeness, but out of deep, aching connection. Gina stepped back from the microphone, her chest heaving with emotion. She had done it. She hadn't just told her story. She had taken it back. The applause faded into a heavy, expectant silence. Gina stood at the center of it, the microphone warm against her trembling fingers. The host gave her a small, encouraging nod from the sidelines. It was time to go deeper. Time to speak the words she had never dared to even whisper to herself. She swallowed hard, feeling the knot of fear and shame lodged in her chest. The crowd, hundreds of women, watched her, but there was no judgment in their faces, only a fierce, unwavering patience. They were waiting for her. They believed she had something worth saying. Gina closed her eyes for half a breath, grounding herself. And then she spoke. I spent 15 years being a ghost in my own life. Her voice cracked, raw and unvarnished. No theatrics, no grand speeches, just the pure, bleeding truth. At first I thought love meant sacrifice, that if I just gave a little more, smiled a little harder, stayed a little quieter, he would see me, really see me. A few heads bowed in the audience, as if in silent prayer. But he didn't, softly. And every time he looked past me, every time my words dissolved into the air between us, I disappeared a little more. Gina's throat burned, but she pressed on, until one day I realized I wasn't living anymore. I was just existing, like a shadow trailing behind someone else's life. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with collective grief and recognition. She glanced up and met the eyes of a woman, in the second row, red-rimmed, glistening with tears. Another woman clutched a tissue tightly in her hand, nodding along. Gina steadied herself with a deep breath, her hands no longer shaking. I thought speaking up would make me selfish. Pause. I thought asking for more would make me ungrateful. But staying silent, that was the real betrayal. Betraying the girl I used to be. The girl who laughed loud, who dreamed wide, who believed she was worth hearing. Her voice grew stronger, anchored in something she hadn't felt in years. Righteousness, dignity. Today is the first time I'm telling the truth out loud. And it's terrifying. But it's also freeing. The crowd remained silent, but it was not the silence of disinterest. It was the silence of reverence, 1,000 hearts holding their breath alongside hers. Gina's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't shy away from them. She let them fall, let them be seen. For once, she wasn't hiding. If you feel invisible, deep breath. If you think your voice doesn't matter, I am standing here to tell you it does. You do. She stepped back from the microphone, her chest rising and falling with a new kind of breath, one that tasted like liberation. For a long moment, nothing moved, Then one woman rose to her feet, clapping, then another and another, until the entire room stood, applauding, their faces shining with tears and fierce pride. Gina stood there, trembling not with fear, but with awe. She was not alone. She had never been alone. She had just been waiting to find the others who could see her, and now she was finally seen. David always believed he was untouchable. The charming smile, the polished speeches, the carefully curated life that looked perfect from the outside. It had all served him well, until now. The first crack came quietly, a whisper in a boardroom. An article tucked deep into the business section, hinting at financial mismanagement under his watch. David brushed it off. They were jealous, he told himself. They always are. But whispers grew into rumors, rumors into investigations, investigations into headlines. The morning Gina's story from the panel went viral, her soft, powerful words echoing across social media. David's phone buzzed nonstop, not with congratulations, not with business deals, but with scandal. A disgruntled employee had come forward, then another, and another. Stories of mistreatment, of broken promises, of a man who cared only for image and power, not for people. David slammed his phone down on the marble countertop hard enough to crack the screen. Outside the wide windows of his once grand office, the city skyline blurred under a gray drizzle. He was losing control, and he didn't know how to stop it. His meetings dried up. Partnerships dissolved. Even his so-called friends stopped answering his calls. At home, the silence was deafening. The big cold house Gina once floated through, like a ghost, now felt like a tomb. No warm dinners waiting, no soft laughter filling the corners. Just David, alone, with only his growing bitterness for company. Meanwhile, Gina was nowhere to be found. She had stepped into a new light, one he couldn't dim. Photos of her smiling with other women at community events. Articles praising her bravery and authenticity. Gina's face, once pale and withdrawn, now glowed with a fierce kind of joy. And David? He spent nights pacing the floors of the mansion he had once ruled, liquor in hand, mind spinning. How had he let her slip away? How had he not seen the storm building inside the woman he thought he could silence? The more Gina rose, the smaller David became. His desperate attempts to fix his reputation only dug his grave deeper. One evening, he stood in the living room, staring at the framed family photos still lining the shelves. Images of a perfect life, frozen in time, brittle and hollow. He smashed them one by one, the glass shattering like brittle illusions. For the first time, David understood. Power built on the backs of the unseen is a house made of sand. And the tide had come in. By the time the final scandal broke, misuse of charity funds, it was over. David was finished. The man who once held court at glittering parties now sat alone in the wreckage of his own making. Broken, forgotten. And somewhere, out in the golden light of a new morning, Gina stood tall, steady as a lighthouse, her life just beginning again. The contrast was stark, inevitable, and in a quiet, poetic way, perfect. It was a crisp afternoon when Owen showed up. No call, no warning, just a soft knock at Gina's modest new apartment door. She opened it, expecting a delivery maybe. And there he was, awkward, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, eyes carrying the weight of words he had rehearsed 100 times. "Gina, can I come in?" he asked, voice low, uncertain. She stepped aside, more out of habit than invitation. The apartment smelled of fresh coffee and blooming lilies. A small space, but it felt warm, alive. Hers. Owen lingered near the doorway, unsure where he fit anymore. I owe you an apology, he started, twisting his hands. For all the times I didn't listen, for making you feel small, invisible. Gina watched him quietly, her face calm, almost detached. Once those words would have cracked her open like glass. Once she would have clung to them like a lifeline. But now? Now they felt unnecessary. She didn't need Owen's guilt to heal the parts of herself he had once ignored. Still, she let him speak. Let him stumble through admissions and regrets. Not out of cruelty, but because she knew he needed to say it more than she needed to hear it. I see now how much you gave, Owen said, voice breaking, and how little I ever gave back. I'm so sorry, Gina. Silence settled between them, not heavy, not hostile, just final. Gina offered a small, kind smile. Not forgiveness, not bitterness, just peace. I'm glad you found your truth, she said simply, her voice steady, kind. She didn't offer him a hug. She didn't invite him to stay. Owen shifted on his feet, realizing the conversation, like the relationship, had nowhere left to go. He had come seeking absolution, closure. But Gina had already closed that chapter, quietly, completely. Wish you the best, Owen, she said gently, walking him back to the door. The finality in her voice wasn't cruel. It was firm, empowered. Owen hesitated for a moment longer, searching her face for something. Recognition, warmth, a thread to hold on to. But Gina was already gone, in a way he couldn't reach anymore. When the door clicked softly shut behind him, Gina turned back toward her kitchen, humming under her breath, a small content sound. She poured herself a cup of coffee, sat by the sunlit window, watched the world move on. No drama, no tears, no desperate need for validation, just her. Whole, standing steady in her own skin. For the first time in years, Gina realized she was enough. All along, she had been enough. The mornings felt different now. There was no rush, no frantic scrambling to please someone else. Just Gina, a warm mug of coffee cradled in her hands, sunlight streaming through the gauzy curtains of her little apartment. She had started small. Tiny acts of rebellion against the years she had spent shrinking herself. A pottery class on Tuesday evenings. Weekend hikes with a local women's group. Learning to say no without guilt and yes without fear. Each choice stitched a new piece into the quilt of her life. Messy, colorful, authentic. At the local bookstore, the owner had started setting aside titles she thought Gina might love. Your recommendations are always so thoughtful, the woman said one afternoon, handing Gina a memoir about resilience. Gina blinked, a little stunned at first. Respect. Simple, effortless respect. At a cafe downtown, the barista remembered her name, her order, even asked her about her new pottery project. She wasn't invisible anymore. Not because she had demanded space, but because she had quietly claimed it. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping victories. Just steady, patient rebuilding. She repainted the second-hand dresser in her bedroom a deep, defiant teal, hung watercolor paintings she'd made herself, adopted an old, grumpy cat from the shelter, and named him Harvey. At night, Harvey curled against her legs, purring like a small motor, grounding her in the reality of a life she had chosen. One evening, after a panel event where Gina had been invited back, not just to speak, but to mentor others, she walked home under a sky littered with stars. Her phone buzzed with a message from a woman she'd met at the event. Your story made me feel seen. Thank you. Gina clutched the phone to her chest, her heart full but calm. Not desperate for validation, simply grateful to be part of something bigger than the pain that once defined her. In the quiet, in the small, unnoticed hours of everyday life, Gina found something she hadn't known she was searching for. A quiet redemption. A self no longer lost in the noise of other people's expectations. A life fully, gloriously her own. And this time, she wasn't fading into the background. She was standing softly, steadily, right in the center of it. David had always built his world on appearances. Polished smiles, perfect suits, lavish charity galas where he gave just enough to seem noble, while quietly taking twice as much from everyone around him. But cracks, once ignored, have a way of spreading. The first scandal hit the local news like a whispered rumor catching fire. Financial mismanagement at one of his smaller companies. Funds mysteriously missing. Employees unpaid. David brushed it off at first. Hired slick lawyers. Posted self-righteous videos online, dripping with performative outrage. "I'm being attacked by jealous competitors," he said, hand over heart. But then came the second scandal, then the third, and then the fourth. Anonymous sources leaked, damning emails. Board members resigned one by one. Old business partners he once humiliated came back with receipts, eager to watch him drown. David's empire, once towering and untouchable, collapsed faster than anyone expected. The media tore into him like vultures over a carcass. Social media roasted him into memes overnight. His name, once spoken with admiration, became a punchline. He tried to fight it. Clung to the illusion like a man clinging to driftwood in a storm. He held emergency meetings in crumbling offices, filed desperate lawsuits, made panicked calls to old friends who no longer picked up. Every door he banged on slammed shut. Every rope he reached for frayed in his hands. Gina watched it unfold like a distant spectator. No anger, no triumph, just quiet detachment. At a cafe one afternoon, she overheard two women talking about him. Can you believe it? Honestly, he always seemed slimy to me. Gina stirred her coffee slowly, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. There was no satisfaction in his suffering, no thrill in his downfall, because it wasn't about him anymore. David's collapse had once been her greatest secret fantasy during the worst nights. A twisted hope that if he fell, somehow she'd be free. But freedom hadn't come from his failure. It had come from her choice to walk away. Long before the world saw his true face, she had already stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. The last she heard, David had moved into a dingy apartment 2 cities away. Living off the scraps of what little was left after lawsuits and settlements drained him dry. He had become a shadow, a man unrecognizable even to himself. One rainy evening, as Gina locked up the community center after a mentoring session, she noticed a figure sitting across the street, slouched under a broken umbrella. For a moment she thought it might be him, thin, defeated. But she didn't cross the road, didn't wave, didn't even slow down. She simply tucked her umbrella closer against the rain, pulled her coat tighter around her, and kept walking, steady, unbothered, free. David had finally disappeared from the world he once ruled. But more importantly, he had disappeared from her world too. And Gina was just getting started. The invitation came on a cool, crisp afternoon. A simple text, 8 words. Would you have dinner with me? Owen. Gina stared at it for a long moment, the screen casting a faint glow against her palm. There was a time, not so long ago, when a message like that would have sent her heart racing. Hope, fear, desperation, an entire storm of emotions battling inside her. But now there was only a quiet, measured stillness. She set the phone down carefully and returned to folding laundry, the rhythmic motions anchoring her. Owen's apology had been sincere, she had no doubt, but she no longer needed it to stitch herself back together. She had already mended her own seams. Later that evening, sitting at her small kitchen table, Gina reread the text. She thought about the version of herself who once would have rushed to reply. The version who would have worn her best dress, rehearsed lines in her head, hoping, aching for acceptance. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone steadier. Someone who understood that forgiveness didn't always require an audience, and closure didn't always come wrapped in apologies. She tapped out a simple response. Sure, tomorrow at 7? Not for reconciliation, not to rekindle anything, but because facing the past on her own terms was part of her journey. She wasn't meeting Owen to heal old wounds. She had already done that work herself. She was meeting him as a woman who owed herself the dignity of choosing, not from a place of lack, but from a place of power. The next evening as she dressed, she didn't reach for the glamorous, uncomfortable outfits she once wore to impress. Instead, she chose a soft navy sweater, fitted jeans, and a pair of simple boots, comfortable, confident herself. As she left the house, Gina caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. No mask, no armor. Just a woman who had learned how to stand still and strong within her own skin. By the time she arrived at the small Italian restaurant Owen had suggested, she wasn't nervous. She was curious. Curious to see what it would feel like to sit across from a man who once broke her spirit and feel absolutely nothing he could take from her anymore. As she pulled open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, a slow, steady breath filled her lungs. Act 3 wasn't about him. It was about her, and she was ready. The restaurant hummed with soft conversation and the clink of silverware against plates. Candlelight flickered on the white tablecloths, casting a warm, intimate glow. Owen stood as Gina approached, a tentative smile stretching across his face. He looked older somehow, less certain, more fragile. Gina offered a polite nod as she slipped into the chair across from him. No warmth, but no bitterness either. Just calm, measured detachment. They exchanged a few pleasantries. The weather, work, small talk that floated between them, light and meaningless. Owen cleared his throat, setting down his wine glass with a soft clink. I owe you more than an apology, he said, voice low. I owe you everything. Gina met his eyes, unflinching. Once those words might have sent a tremor through her. Now they barely stirred the surface. He spoke in earnest, about how he had been blind to her pain, about how he had taken her loyalty for granted, about how much he admired her now, seeing her strength, her independence. Gina listened. She nodded where appropriate, gave small smiles where expected, but inside, she felt free. There was no spark of old longing, no desperate hope clawing at her heart. She didn't need his admiration. She didn't crave his regret. She had found validation in herself. As Owen continued, his words growing, more impassioned, Gina realized something profound. This moment wasn't for her. It was for him. He needed to say these things to unburden himself. He needed to believe he could fix something he had broken. But Gina didn't need him to fix it. She had already rebuilt herself piece by piece without his help. When he finished, breathless and pleading for some sign of forgiveness, Gina smiled gently. I appreciate you saying all that, Owen, she said, voice steady. I really do. He leaned in slightly, hope flashing in his eyes. But, she continued, picking up her fork with a casual grace, I didn't come here looking for anything. Not forgiveness, not closure, not even answers. Owen's face faltered. "I came because I wanted to see if I still needed any of it," Gina said, setting her napkin neatly on her lap. "And it turns out I don't." A soft silence settled between them. Heavy for him, light for her. Gina ate her meal slowly, savoring each bite, while Owen struggled to find footing in a conversation that had already ended. She talked about her work, her hobbies, her plans. Not as a way to impress him, but simply because they were hers. By the time dessert was served, Owen had fallen silent, a shadow of the confident man who once thought the world should revolve around him. And Gina. She glowed, not from the candlelight, but from the quiet certainty rooted deep within her. When the check arrived, she insisted on paying for her own meal. No ties, no debts, no unfinished business. As she stood to leave, Owen rose, too, searching her face for something he couldn't quite name. "Take care, Owen," Gina said softly, her voice kind but final. She walked out into the cool night, her steps light and unburdened. Behind her, the door swung closed with a soft click. Ahead of her, the city stretched wide and bright, full of possibility, full of life, full of herself. Gina didn't look back. Gina stood outside the restaurant for a moment, letting the night air cool her cheeks. She could still see Owen through the window, his shoulders slumped, his face buried in his hands, but she felt nothing, no pity, no anger, only peace. Her phone buzzed in her purse. A message from Owen. "Please, let's talk one more time. I'll wait." Gina stared at the screen for a long moment, then calmly slipped the phone back into her purse. She didn't owe him, or anyone, another conversation. Yet, something inside her urged her to answer, not for him, for herself. To speak her truth, clearly and finally. She turned back, walking to the restaurant's entrance once more. Owen looked up as she entered, his face lighting with a desperate, flickering hope. Gina approached the table but didn't sit. Instead, she placed both hands lightly on the back of the chair, steady and composed. "Owen," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm grateful you said what you did tonight. It took courage. I respect that." He opened his mouth to reply, but she lifted a hand, stopping him gently. "But I'm not the same woman you once knew." Her words were even, not cruel. "I'm not waiting for anyone's permission to live my life anymore. Not yours. Not David's." Owen's face tightened, a flash of guilt washing over him. "I spent too many years molding myself into someone who was easy to overlook. Easy to dismiss," Gina continued, her tone steady. "But I'm done with that." She took a slow breath, feeling each word resonate deep within her chest. "I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. I'm free." Owen's hands fidgeted on the table, searching for something to anchor him. Gina didn't offer it. "I hope you find peace too," she said kindly. "But you'll have to find it without me." For a moment, the only sound between them was the soft clatter of dishes from the nearby kitchen. Then quietly, Gina turned and walked away. She didn't rush. She didn't look back. Each step felt lighter, stronger, like she was shedding the last remnants of the life that had once trapped her. Outside, the night felt different now. Not heavy with loneliness, but vast with possibility. Gina slipped her phone into airplane mode, tucked it away, and smiled to herself. There were no more chains, no more waiting rooms in someone else's life. She was her own beginning now, her own story, her own home, and for the first time in a long, long while. Gina felt whole. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. Gina stood at the front door, the cool air outside brushing against her skin, a stark contrast to the weight she felt inside. David had called earlier, asking to meet, again. This time, He had said he wanted to apologize, but Gina knew better now. She'd been through this before. His rehearsed words, his crocodile tears. Promises that always melted away like smoke the minute he turned away. And yet she couldn't ignore the lingering urge to face him. To see, one last time, if there was anything real beneath the facade. She pushed open the door and stepped outside, locking it behind her, the sound final. As she walked down the path toward the car, she was acutely aware of the silence that had replaced her once chaotic life. David was waiting at the corner of the street, his figure hunched, looking tired, older, defeated. He straightened when he saw her approach, but his eyes were wary, guarded. "Gina," he said, his voice soft, laced with urgency. "I'm so sorry. I've made so many mistakes." Gina stopped a few feet away from him, standing tall. She felt an unexpected calmness settle over her. "I don't need your apologies, David," she replied, her voice unwavering. "I'm not here for any more of your explanations. I don't need to understand why you did what you did. What I needed was for you to see me, but you never did." He winced, as if her words stung deeper than anything he'd ever felt. "I've hurt you, I know that. But I've changed. I've been to therapy. I've realized how wrong I was." David's eyes glistened, that familiar desperation creeping into his tone. "Please, I need you to believe me. I'm sorry for everything." Gina's gaze didn't falter. She saw through him. His words a script he'd memorized long ago, delivered with practiced precision. And she wasn't buying it anymore. "You've always been sorry when it was convenient for you," she said, her voice low but steady. "Always, when it was too late, or when your world was crumbling. But what about when I needed you? When you ignored me? When you chose your career, your friends, and your pride over me?" David opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat, as if something had shifted between them. For a long moment, Gina didn't say anything. She just stood there, staring at him with clear, unclouded eyes. The air between them felt dense, heavy with years of unresolved hurt. But Gina stood unaffected, unshaken. "I used to look for you, in the cracks of every fight, hoping you would see me. I used to apologize for everything that went wrong between us, even when it wasn't my fault, just so you wouldn't leave," she continued. "But I'm not that woman anymore." David took a step closer, but Gina held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "No." Her voice was sharp now, filled with the power of someone who had spent far too long in the shadows, but had finally stepped into the light. "Don't come any closer." He froze, the weight of her words hitting him like a blow. Her eyes were cold now, and her expression was one of finality. "I don't need you to fix anything anymore. I don't need you to apologize. I need nothing from you." She took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, savoring the freedom that rushed through her. "I've found myself, and I don't need anyone to validate that." David's face twisted. The old man she had once loved, now gone, replaced by a stranger who couldn't comprehend the strength she had found in herself. "You can't just walk away from everything we had," he said, his voice pleading now, desperate for some kind of response. "I'm not walking away," Gina replied, her voice firm, no hint of hesitation. "I'm choosing myself. I'm choosing to live a life that's mine, not one that you dictated for me." For a long, agonizing second, David stood still, absorbing her words. Then with a deep, frustrated sigh, he let his shoulders slump. "I don't know who you are anymore," he muttered, almost to himself. Gina's heart didn't break. It didn't feel pity. It just felt emptier. But emptier in a way that was good, necessary. "You'll never know," she said softly, almost with a touch of sadness, "because the woman I used to be, the one you thought you could control and break, I'm never going back to her." David was silent. Gina didn't need him to say anything else. She had said all that needed to be said, without another word. She turned and walked away, her back straight and her steps deliberate. David didn't call her back. He didn't try to stop her, and Gina didn't look back, because she was done. She had nothing left to prove. She was free. Gina stepped out of the front door, the cool evening air greeting her like a breath of fresh air, untainted by the suffocating weight of years spent in a gilded cage. The house behind her, once a symbol of her life with David, now seemed foreign, a vague, distant echo of everything she had given and lost. As she closed the door softly, she didn't look back. There was nothing left to look at. For years, this place had been her prison and her sanctuary. She'd poured herself into their home, into David, into everything that was meant to keep their fragile world intact. But now, that world was crumbling, its walls cracked, its foundations rotting. All that remained were the remnants of a past she no longer recognized. The soft click of the door locking behind her was like a final nail in the coffin of the life she had once clung to. She walked down the driveway, her steps deliberate, each one a small victory. With every footfall, she shed a piece of the woman she used to be, the one who had begged for scraps of affection, the one who had fought to be seen by a man who was too blind to notice her. Her heart no longer ached as it had before, but there was a certain heaviness that lingered, like the last vestiges of a storm that had passed but left its mark. She had loved him once, and she had given everything for him. But now, love had turned into something unrecognizable, and what remained was the stark clarity of who she was without him. The car was parked at the curb, its engine purring in the cool evening air. As she slid into the driver's seat, she caught a glimpse of the house in the rearview mirror. The lights in the windows, once warm and inviting, now looked cold, distant. It was the same house, but it no longer held the same meaning. She started the engine, the sound of it filling the silence of the night. As the car pulled away, the streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the asphalt, but the darkness no longer felt like a threat. It felt freeing, like the space between her and her past. The drive was quiet, save for the hum of the road beneath her tires, but her mind was anything but still. She thought of the years spent trying to hold it all together, of the nights she'd lain awake, listening to the soft, insistent tick of the clock on the wall, wondering when she'd be enough for him. But now, she was enough for herself. She thought of the conversations that had once been full of empty promises and half-hearted apologies. How many times had she listened, hoping for something real, only to be met with more empty words? How many times had she waited for him to change, for him to see her, only to watch him drift further away? She didn't need to answer those questions. The truth was, she had never been invisible. She had just allowed herself to be. She had allowed herself to fade into the background of his life, because she thought that was all she deserved. But now, she saw herself clearly. She didn't need his validation, his approval, or his love. She had given herself all of that, and it was enough. The city skyline came into view, the lights twinkling in the distance like 1,000 promises of a future she would build on her own terms. The thought was liberating. The future stretched out before her wide and open, like an endless road that was hers to travel. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding on until she let go. At the next stoplight, she glanced down at her phone, but there were no messages from David, no missed calls, no texts. He hadn't tried to reach out after their confrontation earlier that day. He had known. He had known she was done. The thought should have left her empty, but instead it filled her with a quiet pride. She had finally freed herself. The house in the rear-view mirror faded, and with it, so did the last lingering traces of her old life. She wasn't looking back. There was nothing to return to. Gina felt the weight in her chest lift as she turned onto the main road, the city lights now filling her vision with the promise of something new. There would be no more waiting, no more hiding. She was no longer a ghost in her own life. She was ready to be seen, ready to live, ready to reclaim the pieces of herself she had lost along the way. As she drove into the night, she knew this was just the beginning. There were no more goodbyes, no more what-ifs, no more apologies. The door had closed, but it had also opened, wide to everything she had been waiting for, and this time she would walk through it alone, but stronger than ever before. The dinner was set, though the room felt quieter than it had any right to. The soft clink of silverware and the hushed murmurs of other patrons were distant sounds as Gina sat across from Owen, her gaze cool and steady. The man before her, once her confidant, her partner in moments of fleeting happiness, was no longer someone she recognized. He had changed, but so had she, and the distance between them now felt like a chasm. Owen, trying to mask his unease, leaned forward, his voice quiet but urgent. "Gina, I need you to understand. I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything, what happened between us. Wasn't just your fault or mine, but—" He paused, searching for words, but they felt heavy in the air between them. Gina didn't rush him. She allowed him the silence, knowing that whatever came next would be his attempt to rewrite their past, to justify his actions. She had heard this narrative before, and now it felt as hollow as the space between them. He continued, his voice shaky with guilt. "I was selfish. I know that. I put my career above us, above you. But it wasn't. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never intended to hurt you. You have to believe that." Gina's fingers tightened around her glass, the cool surface grounding her, reminding her of the calm that had settled over her in recent months. There was no anger in her, no fire, no rage, just a quiet, almost surreal understanding that his words didn't matter anymore. She wasn't the same woman who had once clung to his every excuse, his every apology. "You always had an explanation, Owen," she said softly, her voice unwavering, the finality in it clear. "And it always sounded so convincing. But it doesn't matter anymore. The truth is, I don't need your explanation. I don't need your redemption." Owen recoiled slightly, the words striking him with an unexpected force. His eyes searched hers, looking for a hint of the woman who had once been lost, who had craved validation from him. But there was nothing. No cracks in her resolve. No sign of the Gina he used to know. He began, but she held up a hand, cutting him off gently but firmly. "I don't need you to fix what's broken, Owen. What's broken is already fixed," she said, her tone steady, but carrying the weight of everything she had endured. "I've been carrying this for so long, trying to make sense of what went wrong, what I could have done differently. But I've realized that I was never the problem. It was never about me needing you to change or needing you to apologize. It was about me needing to change, to see myself differently. And I've done that." Her words hung in the air between them, thick with the silence of understanding. Owen stared at her, his face a mixture of disbelief and regret. But more than that, confusion. The woman sitting before him wasn't the same one who had once begged for his love, his approval, his attention. Gina's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile, not one of bitterness or anger, but of peace, something she had found within herself. "I needed you to be something you never could be. I spent so much of my life trying to find myself through you, through your actions, through your words. But now I'm finally realizing that I am enough. I don't need you to validate me. I don't need you to apologize. I've already forgiven myself." Owen swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if the weight of her words was pressing down on him. He opened his mouth to speak again, but the words faltered on his lips. There was nothing left to say. the woman before him, had seen through every mask, every excuse he had used to shield himself from the consequences of his actions. She no longer needed him, not in the way she once had. The realization hit him like a wave, and for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to be seen, not in the way he had always been accustomed to, through his career, his power, his control, but through the eyes of a woman who had learned to see herself fully and completely. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice quieter now, almost inaudible, but Gina just shook her head, her expression soft but resolute. "I don't need your apology, Owen, not anymore." With that, the final thread between them snapped. The emotional tether that had once bound her to him was severed, leaving her free, truly free, for the first time in years. She stood up, the movement graceful, her presence powerful in its quiet confidence. As she turned to leave, she glanced back at him one last time. "I wish you the best, Owen. But I found my peace, and it's not here," she said, her voice calm but resolute. Owen sat in the stillness, the weight of her words sinking in. He watched her walk away, her silhouette, growing smaller with each step, and for the first time he understood. Gina didn't need him. She never had. Gina sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the weight of the silence pressing down on her like a physical presence. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound breaking through the stillness, but it felt distant, like a reminder of how far she had come from the chaotic noise of her old life. The room was hers now, a place where no one could intrude, no one could impose their presence, their expectations on her. It was the quiet that she had fought for, and yet tonight it seemed almost too much. The evening sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the room bathed in the soft, muted glow of the overhead lamp. Her feet were tucked beneath her, curled up on the couch in the way that felt most comfortable now, the way she had learned to sit with herself. A cup of tea sat untouched on the coffee table in front of her, steam arising from the surface dipping. Wisps that disappeared into the air. Her gaze shifted to the window, to the dark outline of the trees outside, the wind stirring their branches. She had become accustomed to moments like these, alone, but not lonely. And yet, tonight, something lingered. A quiet ache that had been there for years, something she had buried so deep that it no longer felt like a wound but a scar. The ghosts of the past still haunted her in subtle ways, not in the loud, overwhelming presence of her former life, but in the quieter, more insidious spaces between breaths, between thoughts. She could still feel the remnants of the woman she used to be, the one who had been desperate for approval, who had poured everything she had into a marriage that never truly saw her, who had held on to the hope that things could change, that David could change. The woman who had begged for validation from Owen, from her own reflection, from everyone but herself. But that woman was gone. She had been replaced by someone stronger, someone more self-assured, and yet there was a tenderness, a vulnerability, that still flickered within her like a light that had not yet fully extinguished. It wasn't a weakness. It was simply a part of her journey. She had learned to embrace it. A sigh escaped her lips as she leaned back into the couch, closing her eyes for a moment. The stillness allowed her to finally feel the exhaustion that had built up over the years, the emotional exhaustion of holding herself together, of pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. But now, in this silence, she no longer had to pretend. She thought about the decisions she had made, the steps she had taken toward her own healing. Every day had been a small victory, and yet there was no grand moment of triumph. There was no loud, celebratory mark of achievement. Instead, it had been a quiet evolution, one that had required her to peel back the layers of who she had been, to look at the raw parts of herself that she had hidden away for so long. Her heart still ached for the life she had lost, the family she had once dreamt of, the future she had planned with David. But it wasn't the same kind of ache as before. This one was more like the echo of a distant memory, a reminder of what was, not what could have been. She had come to accept that. The past had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. And yet, there was a pang of regret, a quiet longing for the comfort of the life she had once known, for the illusion of security that had been shattered. The truth settled in her chest, heavy but not unbearable. Loneliness still lived here, in this space. It wasn't something she had been able to rid herself of entirely, despite everything she had gained. It was a quiet companion, one that often crept in during the stillness of the night, when the world outside was quiet and her thoughts were left to echo in the corners of her mind. But it was different now. She wasn't afraid of it anymore. Gina opened her eyes, the weight of the past, now something she could hold in her hands, look at, and acknowledge without fear. She had faced it head on, had survived the worst of it, and in doing so, she had learned something profound. Peace didn't come from being free of pain. It came from accepting it, from making room for it in her life, and letting it exist alongside the moments of joy. The loneliness wasn't something to fight against. It was simply a part of her, and just like every other scar she carried, it was a reminder of how far she had come. A small, genuine smile tugged at her lips as she stood and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. Outside, the world moved on, indifferent to her journey, but she was no longer chasing approval from it. She had found peace, not by running from the shadows of her past, but by standing in them, owning them, and allowing herself to grow. Tonight, the loneliness was not an enemy. It was simply a reminder that she had learned to live with herself, and that was enough. The early morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and golden, casting long shadows across the floor. Gina stood by the window, staring out at the quiet street below, her hands pressed against the cool glass. The world outside was still, the way it often felt in the moments before the day truly began. But inside her, everything had shifted. She was no longer who she had been, no longer the woman trapped in the silence of her own life, hidden behind the roles she had played for so long. The weight of the past, once a constant burden, had lightened in ways she couldn't have predicted. She had fought for this, fought for her voice, for her space, for her independence, and now it was hers. She had found the courage to reclaim herself, piece by piece, with every decision, every word, and every quiet step forward. And yet, as she stood there, looking out over the familiar view, there was no triumphal fanfare. There were no accolades, no recognition from the outside world. It was a quiet kind of victory, one that didn't need to be seen by others to be meaningful. The peace she had fought for was her own. Her thoughts drifted back to the beginning of her journey, the moments when she had felt so invisible, so small. She had once believed her worth was tied to others, to their approval, their love, their validation. She had given herself away so freely, always putting others first, always bending and reshaping herself to fit the expectations of those around her. But in doing so, she had lost sight of herself. She had become a shadow, a backdrop to the lives of the people she loved. Now standing here in her own home, Gina felt the weight of that lost time, but it no longer felt like regret. It was simply part of her story that she now fully owned. She had learned to fill her own space, to occupy her own life. No longer would she be the woman waiting in the wings, hoping for recognition. She had learned to see herself, to stand firm in who she was without apology. The small victories she had collected along the way, each moment of standing up for herself, each decision to walk away from what no longer served her, had added up to something far more powerful than she had ever imagined. She had found her own strength, the strength to let go of what was not hers to carry, and to embrace the truth of who she had become. Her fingers brushed the edge of the windowsill, a small gesture, but one that felt significant. It was a reminder of the small, everyday moments that had led her to this point. It was in these small actions, these simple choices, that she had reclaimed herself. The act of standing still in her own life, of choosing not to move in response to the demands of others, was the most empowering decision she had ever made. Gina smiled softly, not out of pride, but out of peace. She had fought her battles, confronted her fears, and let go of the chains that once held her. The journey had been long, but it had brought her to a place where she could finally say with confidence, "I am enough." She turned away from the window, her reflection now catching her eye in the glass. She looked at herself, really looked at herself, and saw something she had never seen before. A woman who had learned to live for herself, to honor her own needs, to nurture her own heart. It was a simple truth, but one that carried so much weight. She was not defined by her past, not by the mistakes of others, or by the expectations of anyone but herself. She was who she was, strong, capable, and whole. The small affirmations she had repeated to herself in quiet moments had grown into something deeper, more rooted in reality. She no longer needed anyone else's approval, because she had learned to give it to herself. She was free, not just from the constraints of her marriage, her relationships, or her past, but free to embrace the fullness of her life, whatever it looked like. As she walked across the room, the floor creaking beneath her feet, she felt a sense of calm that settled deep within her chest. She was at peace with herself, with her choices, and with the life she was building. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its challenges, but it was hers. She had built it from the ground up, piece by piece, through every moment of doubt, every tear, and every victory. For the first time in a long time, Gina allowed herself to feel truly proud, not because of anything external, but because she had come to accept who she was. She had fought for her peace, for her voice, for her place in this world. And in the quiet of this morning, with the soft light casting shadows across the floor, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had found herself again. And that, she realized, was the greatest gift she could ever give herself. "Enough," she whispered to her reflection. "I am enough." And with that, she turned away, ready to face whatever came next with strength and grace. Gina stood at the front of the room, her eyes sweeping over the crowd of women before her. The space was quiet, expectant, filled with the gentle hum of nervous energy. It wasn't her first panel. It wasn't even the first time she had spoken publicly about her journey. But today felt different. There was a weight to this moment, a heaviness that had little to do with the room or the people in it, but with the words she was about to speak. She had been invited to share her thoughts on forgiveness, something she had learned the hard way, a subject so deeply intertwined with her own healing, yet something she had never fully understood until now. She had spent years trapped in the belief that forgiveness was something you did for others, that it was about letting people off the hook, excusing their actions, and offering them peace. But what she had learned was far more powerful, far more freeing. Taking a slow breath, Gina opened her mouth, her voice calm, steady. She no longer had the trembling uncertainty that once marked her words. "Forgiveness," she began, "isn't about them. It's about us. It's about us freeing ourselves from the chains of anger, of resentment, of the past." A pause. She allowed the words to sink in, not rushing them, knowing that the weight of what she was saying would need time to resonate. She could feel the eyes of the audience on her, their attention sharp, hungry for her wisdom. This was the moment she had been waiting for, not for validation, but for the opportunity to share what she had learned through her own trials. I used to think that forgiveness meant that I had to forget, Gina continued, that I had to erase the pain and let the people who hurt me walk away scot-free. I thought that was what made you strong. That's what made you the better person, right? A soft laugh escaped her lips, not bitter, but reflective. But I've realized that true forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's not about letting them go without facing the truth of what they've done. It's about releasing the power they still hold over you. It's about finding peace within yourself, regardless of whether they ever apologize or change. Gina's hands were steady as she spoke, but inside, her heart felt lighter with each passing word. She had come so far, from that woman who had once been crushed by the weight of her past, to the woman standing here today, unburdened by the need for validation. She had learned that forgiveness was her own gift to herself, not to excuse others, but to reclaim her own peace. When you forgive on your terms, Gina said, her voice unwavering, you take back your power. You're no longer letting the pain dictate your life. You're not chained to the hurt that others caused. You're choosing freedom. She glanced out at the audience, meeting their eyes one by one. She saw the quiet nods, the understanding in their expressions. She knew they were with her. They had all been through their own versions of suffering, their own struggles with forgiveness. But it was in these moments that real connection was forged, in the shared understanding of what it meant to heal. I forgave my ex-husband, not because I wanted to excuse his actions, Gina continued, her gaze softening as she spoke the truth that had been years in the making, but because I couldn't carry the weight of his mistakes any longer. I had spent too much of my life hoping for an apology, waiting for him to understand the damage he had done. But that was a lie I told myself. I didn't need him to apologize for me to move forward. She took a deep breath, her next words coming with a sense of finality, the wisdom of years lived and lessons learned. Forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about you. It's about finding the strength to walk away from the pain and choose peace, even if it means doing so alone. The room was silent, save for the soft sounds of Gina's breath, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of the peace she had claimed for herself. It wasn't a loud, sweeping victory. It wasn't a dramatic moment of triumph. It was quiet, internal, and deeply personal. She had learned the most valuable lesson of all. Forgiveness was not a gift to those who had wronged her. It was a gift to herself. The gift of freedom, of release, of moving on. She had learned to let go of the chains that had once bound her to a life of anger and hurt. And in doing so, she had become the woman she was always meant to be. Strong, free, and unburdened. As she finished speaking, there was a soft murmur of appreciation in the room, a sense of respect, but more importantly, Gina knew she had shared something real, something that would live beyond this room, beyond this moment, in the hearts of the women who had listened. Because she had spoken her truth, and in doing so, she had freed herself, and in turn, given them the strength to do the same. Gina stood in front of the old farmhouse, her gaze fixed on the weathered wood of the porch, the peeling paint of the windows, and the overgrown ivy creeping up the sides of the house. It was a place that had once been home, a place where the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air and the sound of laughter echoed through the halls. But it had also been a place where memories of love lost, betrayal, and years of feeling invisible lingered like dust in the corners. Now it was hers. The decision had been a long time coming. She had spent years running from this place, both physically and emotionally. It had always been a symbol of her past, a life where she had played the supporting role, wife, mother, daughter, but never the leading character. Now, the house was a symbol of something more, a place where she would no longer hide or shrink into the background, but a place where she would begin again on her own terms. She held the keys in her hand, their weight heavier than she had anticipated. It was a simple set, but it felt like the most important thing she had ever held. It was a small, quiet victory. No grand gestures, no celebrations, just the slow realization that she had done it. She had taken back control. This house, this symbol of the life she had once known, was now hers to reshape, to make her own. Her fingers gripped the keys tightly as she stepped up the creaky porch steps, the familiar sound of wood groaning beneath her feet, grounding her in the moment. She paused before opening the door, taking a deep breath. It was strange, this sense of coming home when for so long she had felt like an outsider in her own life. But now, she was here, choosing to come back, not as the woman she had been, but as the woman she had become. The door creaked open, and Gina stepped inside, the cool air of the empty house hitting her like a wave. The silence was thick, but it wasn't oppressive. It was the silence of a space waiting to be filled, a space ready for new memories, new beginnings. She glanced around, taking in the faded wallpaper, the old hardwood floors, and the faint smell of dust that seemed to hang in the air. It was a home that had seen better days, but so had she. The kitchen was where it all began, the heart of the home, where she had spent countless hours preparing meals, nurturing her family, and sacrificing her own needs for the sake of others. It was a place where she had been unseen, unheard, and unnoticed. But now, standing in this kitchen, it felt different. It was hers. Not as a caretaker or a second-class citizen, but as a woman who was finally choosing herself. She set the keys down on the kitchen counter and ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the worn oak table, her mind wandering back to the days when she had prepared meals for David and Owen, when she had poured herself into her family, only to be left feeling drained and invisible. But that was the past, and the past no longer defined her. Her heart swelled with a quiet sense of pride. She had reclaimed this house, not because it was her family's legacy, but because it symbolized her ability to rebuild. She had taken back something that had been taken from her, control over her own life, her own future. Gina walked through the house slowly, as if savoring each moment. The old living room, the worn-out furniture, the small fireplace that had once been a place of warmth and comfort. These were the pieces of her past that she could now shape into something new. It would take time, effort, and money, but she knew it was a journey worth taking. Each brush stroke, each nail hammered into the walls, would be a step towards something better. The emotional weight of this moment settled heavily in her chest. She wasn't just buying a house, she was buying freedom. She was buying the right to exist in her own space, to create a life that reflected who she truly was, not who she had been told to be. As she stood in the center of the living room, Gina closed her eyes for a moment, letting the stillness wash over her. She could feel the past, the memories of her old life, lingering in the corners of the house, but they didn't have the same hold on her anymore. She wasn't here to relive those memories. She was here to create new ones. When she opened her eyes, there was a newfound clarity in her gaze. The house was hers now, and so was her life. With a steady breath, she walked out onto the porch again, her hand brushing against the old railing. The sky above was clear, the sun setting in the distance, casting a warm glow over everything. For the first time in years, Gina felt at peace. She had taken control of her past, and now she was ready to build her future. Gina sat at the small desk by the window, her fingers resting lightly on the smooth surface of the paper in front of her. The first blank page stared back at her, filled with possibilities, but also with the weight of uncertainty. She had never been the type to express herself in this way. Her life had always been lived through others, her words dictated by the roles she played as a wife, a mother, a caretaker. But that was no longer her world. Now, she was a woman in search of her own voice, and she was determined to find it, even if it meant stepping into unfamiliar territory. The decision to start writing had come quietly, without fanfare. It was a gradual pull, like a soft whisper in the back of her mind that had grown louder over the past few months. She had always admired the power of words, how they could change hearts, move mountains, and leave indelible marks on the soul. But she had never considered herself a writer, never thought she had a story to tell. After all, her life had been about listening, not speaking. But things had changed. She had changed. The journey of self-reclamation that she had embarked upon had ignited something inside her. She felt an undeniable need to create, to express, to share her truth with the world, not just as a means of healing, but as a declaration of who she was becoming. Writing felt like the perfect medium, a way to connect with others without needing validation, but simply as an offering of her own experience. She picked up her pen, took a deep breath, and began to write. At first, the words came slowly, almost hesitantly, as if she were testing the waters of a new identity. Her handwriting was delicate, careful, almost timid, but each word she wrote felt like a small victory. She wasn't trying to impress anyone or craft the perfect sentence. She was simply putting her thoughts on the page, allowing her emotions to flow freely. There was a freedom in it, a sense of release that she had never known before. It felt like a conversation with herself, an exploration of the person she had always been and the woman she was still becoming. As the days passed, Gina's confidence grew. The more she wrote, the more she realized how much she had to say. Her voice, once silenced by the weight of others' expectations, was finally being heard, and it felt powerful. She began to experiment with different styles, different themes, exploring the complexities of her emotions, her experiences, and the world around her. She wrote about her struggles, her triumphs, the quiet moments of strength and the loud bursts of anger. She wrote about love and loss, about the small joys that had once gone unnoticed, and about the liberation she now felt in reclaiming her own life. But Gina's journey didn't stop at writing. Her creativity began to spill over into other areas of her life. One afternoon, as she wandered through the small art supply store in town, she found herself drawn to a canvas. It was simple, blank, just waiting for something to be created. Without really thinking, she bought it. She didn't have any grand plans or expectations. She just knew that she wanted to create something new, something that reflected the changes she was experiencing inside. The first few strokes on the canvas were tentative, unsure. She had never painted before, and the idea of expressing herself through color and texture felt daunting. But as she continued, something shifted. The brush seemed to glide across the canvas, each movement feeling more natural, more purposeful. She wasn't trying to paint a masterpiece. She was simply allowing her emotions to take shape through the paint. With each color, each line, she could feel herself shedding layers of fear, of doubt. She was painting her own path forward, a path that was no longer defined by the past. The paintings were raw, abstract, emotional, and most importantly, real. They reflected the complexity of her journey, the contradictions of her emotions, and the quiet strength she had discovered within herself. She hung them on the walls of her new home, allowing them to serve as reminders of her progress, her courage, and her willingness to embrace a new chapter in her life. Soon, Gina began to think about sharing her work with others. At first, the idea seemed almost impossible. What would people think? Would they understand her? But as she stood in front of her paintings, she realized that it didn't matter. She wasn't creating for validation. She was creating for herself, and if others found meaning in it, that was enough. Her work had become a reflection of her own growth, a testimony to her emotional resilience and her transformation. One afternoon, she sent an email to a local gallery, asking if they would be interested in displaying some of her paintings. She didn't know what would come of it, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for someone else to decide her worth. She was taking control, stepping forward with purpose, and allowing herself to be seen in a new light. In the weeks that followed, Gina's art was displayed and her writing found its way into small local publications. She received letters and messages from women who saw themselves in her words, who were inspired by her journey. It wasn't fame or recognition that she sought. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had taken the first steps toward building a life that was fully, unapologetically her own. And with each new creative endeavor, Gina knew that she was no longer the woman who had once been silenced. She was now the author of her own story, and the path before her was wide open, filled with infinite possibilities. Owen appeared at her door one afternoon, his face worn and eyes heavy with regret. He had been calling for days, sending messages that she had ignored, each one growing more desperate. But this time, he stood there in person, a final plea for forgiveness hanging in the air between them. Gina didn't invite him in. She didn't need to. Standing in the doorway, she felt a wave of calm wash over her, an assurance that she had long since let go of the anger, the hurt, and even the need for closure. Owen was a part of her past, but she no longer needed him to define her future. "I know you're angry," he began, his voice raw, but Gina held up a hand to stop him. "No, Owen," she said softly, her voice firm but free from bitterness. "I'm not angry anymore. Not at you. Not at anyone." She took a slow breath, feeling the weight of her own words. There was a quiet strength in them, a finality that made Owen take a step back, his shoulders slumping as he processed the shift in her tone. Gina had always been the one who bent, who forgave, who sacrificed. But not now. Now she stood tall in the doorway of her new life, her hands steady, and her heart no longer chained to the past. "I've learned something about forgiveness," she continued. "It's not for you. It's for me. I forgave you a long time ago, but I don't need it from you anymore." Owen's face tightened, a mix of confusion and pain flickering across it. He opened his mouth, as if searching for words to explain himself, to make her understand just how much he regretted everything. But Gina didn't need him to say anything more. She had spent years waiting for him to change, for him to see her, to value her. But now, in this moment, she realized that none of that mattered. She smiled, but it was a smile that wasn't aimed at Owen. It was a smile of freedom, of liberation, of a woman who had finally reclaimed her power. "I've spent too much of my life seeking approval, seeking validation. But I don't need it anymore. Not from you, not from David, not from anyone. I am enough as I am." Owen's eyes softened, and for a brief moment there was a flicker of the man she had once known. But it was fleeting. He reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them, but Gina didn't move. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't going to let him back in. Not in the way he hoped. "I'm sorry, Gina," he whispered, his voice breaking, but she shook her head. "I know you are. But it's too late for us. You and I, what we were, is gone. And I'm okay with that." With those words, she closed the door gently but decisively. She wasn't angry. She wasn't sad. She was simply letting go. The last thread that had held her to the life she had lived with Owen was severed. As she leaned against the door, feeling the finality of the moment, Gina realized that she had finally freed herself, not from Owen, not from David, but from the past that had once defined her. She was standing in her own truth, her own strength, and for the first time in a long time, she was truly free. The first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, spilling golden light across the fields that stretched out before Gina. She stood at the edge of her reclaimed farmhouse, her hand resting gently on the wooden fence, the cool morning air caressing her face. The house, weathered yet sturdy, stood behind her, a silent witness to the transformation she had undergone, both inside and out. As the sun slowly rose, so did the sense of quiet power that enveloped her. There was no grand celebration, no loud proclamations, just this peaceful moment of reflection. The world was waking up, and so was she, renewed, stronger, and more self-reliant than ever before. She took a deep breath, the scent of the earth filling her lungs. This land, this place, had always been part of her story. It had been where she'd grown up, where she'd loved, where she'd suffered. Now it was a symbol of her reclamation. Every inch of the farmhouse was a testament to the woman she had become. Each crack and creak in the floorboards a whisper of the strength she had found in herself. Her eyes moved across the landscape, the fields that stretched for miles in every direction. The sunrise painted the sky in hues of pink, lavender, and gold, colors that felt like a reflection of her own inner transformation. She wasn't the woman who had once been lost in the shadows of others' expectations. She was her own person, now, standing tall in her truth, ready to embrace the future. In that moment, Gina felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. No longer would she seek validation from anyone, not from David, not from Owen, not from anyone who had tried to make her feel invisible. She had found her voice, and she had found her power. It was hers, and it would never again be dependent on the approval of others. Her gaze turned back to the farmhouse, its weathered exterior now looking less like a reminder of what had been, and more like a symbol of her triumph. This was her place, her home. She had fought for it, fought for her own freedom, and now it was hers to rebuild, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, and creatively. She was not the woman she had been. She was the woman she had always been meant to become. A breeze stirred her hair as she stepped forward, the ground beneath her feet firm and solid. There was a quiet strength in the way she moved, a sense of purpose in every step. She had already begun to write her new story, and it was one she would tell on her own terms. As the sun rose higher in the sky, Gina stood tall, her silhouette framed by the light, a woman reborn. She wasn't looking for approval. She wasn't waiting for anyone to see her. She had already seen herself, for the first time truly, and that was enough. This was her moment. This was her time. And as the light of a new day bathed her in its warmth, Gina smiled. It was the smile of someone who knew exactly who she was, where she had been, and where she was going.